The deputy slammed her into the supply room wall hard enough to rattle the shelving units behind her, his forearm across her collarbone, badge catching the fluorescent light like a warning. Nurses froze in the hallway. Nobody moved. Deputy Travis Holloway was 6'2" and accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them, and this one was no different, except for the woman pinned against the wall, who wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't even raising her voice. She looked at him with the kind of stillness that didn't come from weakness. It came from somewhere else entirely. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "who you just put your hands on." If this story has you hooked already, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The emergency department at Calloway General Hospital had a particular smell at 6 in the morning. Industrial cleaner over something beneath it that never quite went away. The ghost of 100 crises soaking into the linoleum. Claire Voss had worked this floor for 3 years, and she barely noticed the smell anymore. What she noticed was the rhythm, the monitors, the gurneys, the way a quiet morning could pivot into catastrophe in under 40 seconds. She had learned to read a room the way most people read a clock. At a glance, she knew what was wrong and roughly how long she had to fix it. She was 34, with dark circles she'd stopped trying to hide and a ponytail she'd pulled together in the parking lot. Her scrubs were clean. Her movements were efficient. She was not the kind of nurse who chatted up the staff at shift change or lingered over coffee in the break room. She came in, she assessed, she worked. The patients called her by name. The doctors flagged her when something was going sideways because Claire Voss had a way of staying level when everything else was not. That Tuesday morning started without incident. By 7:15, it had changed. The ambulance brought in a man named Gerald Pruitt, 62, a retired county maintenance worker who'd been living rough on the east side of Harwick, Arizona for the past 8 months. He was dehydrated, his blood pressure was dangerously low, and the EMTs estimated he hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. He was also drunk, though barely, a long way from combative. He was scared and quiet and kept asking about his dog. Claire got him settled into Bay 4, started fluids, ordered a basic metabolic panel, and was checking his arms for a good vein when Deputy Dale Holloway walked in. Holloway worked county. He had the kind of build that looked like it had once been athletic and had since gone soft without the owner quite noticing, and he wore his uniform like a piece of furniture rather than a responsibility. He'd been coming to Calloway General for years, picking up DUI holds, running warrant checks on patients who came in after altercations, occasionally just wandering through the ER because nobody had told him he couldn't. The nursing staff mostly ignored him when they could and tolerated him when they couldn't. He stopped outside Bay 4, looked through the glass at Pruitt, and said to no one in particular, "He's here again." Claire didn't look up from the IV line. He needed fluids. He needed to not pass out in the bus station for the 4th time this month. Holloway stepped into the bay without being invited. "This is a hospital, not a shelter. He's a patient," Claire said. "He gets treated the same as anyone else." Holloway looked at Pruitt the way some people look at things they've already decided are worthless. "He's a drain on county resources, is what he is." Gerald Pruitt had his eyes open. He was listening. Claire saw his jaw tighten. "Deputy," she said, keeping her voice even, "you're not needed in here right now. I'm checking on a known subject. You're standing in my patient's bay without a medical reason, which means you're in the way." She finally looked at him directly. "I'll let you know if we need law enforcement assistance. Right now, we don't." Holloway stared at her for a beat. Something flickered across his face. Not quite anger, not quite embarrassment, but some compound of both that settled into something colder. He looked at Pruitt one more time, then walked out without a word. Claire went back to the IV. Pruitt looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yeah, I did," she said. "Hold still." But the problem with Holloway was that he had been coming to Calloway General long enough to know which nurses would push back and which ones wouldn't. Most of them wouldn't. The ER operated on a kind of low-level institutional anxiety. Administrators wanted smooth relationships with county law enforcement. Charge nurses didn't want complaints filed against the floor, and younger staff had enough to manage without inviting conflict. Claire knew all of this. She had watched it operate for 3 years. She pushed back anyway, not because she was reckless, but because she had been in situations considerably more dangerous than a county deputy with a chip on his shoulder, and she had learned that some things didn't get better if you let them slide. By 9 o'clock, Pruitt was stable enough to sleep. Claire had moved on to 3 other patients and was documenting chart notes when Holloway reappeared, this time with Darla Fitch, the hospital's patient services coordinator, a woman who functioned as the administrative layer between the medical staff and anyone who wanted to complain about them. "Claire," Darla said, with the particular tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news she personally agreed with. "Can I speak with you?" They stepped into the hallway alcove near the supply room. Holloway stood a few feet back, arms crossed. "Deputy Holloway has raised a concern," Darla said. "He's noting that you were obstructive during a lawful check on a subject in your care." "I asked him to leave a patient's bay," Claire said. "He wasn't there for a medical reason. He has every right to be in this facility. In common areas, not in a patient's treatment space without cause." Claire kept her voice professional, though the effort was not nothing. "I can show you the hospital policy if that's helpful." Holloway stepped forward. "What's helpful," he said, "is nurses understanding that they don't run this building." "Neither do you," Claire said. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone said the thing everyone else was thinking but nobody had said out loud. Darla looked acutely uncomfortable. Holloway's expression shifted into something flat and deliberate. "I'm going to file a formal obstruction complaint," he said. "And while we're at it, I want to know why a vial of Dilaudid that was checked out this morning under your credentials is missing from the controlled substance inventory." Claire looked at him. "What?" "Pharmacy flagged it 20 minutes ago. Dilaudid, checked out at 6:52 under your ID badge." "That's not possible," Claire said. "I haven't accessed the controlled substance cabinet today." "The log says otherwise." "Then the log is wrong." She turned to Darla. "Pull the footage from the pharmacy alcove. It'll show who actually accessed that cabinet." Darla said nothing. She looked at Holloway, then back at Claire, and in that look Claire read everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. The footage request took 4 hours to go nowhere. By the time Claire's shift supervisor, a man named Bennett, who had the backbone of warm water, pulled her aside, the story had already metastasized. 3 people had come to him with versions of it. 2 nurses on the floor were talking in the break room. The pharmacy had filed a formal incident report. Holloway had spoken with the hospital's security director, a former sheriff's deputy himself, who had walked the floor twice and made his sympathies clear without saying a word. "I have to put you on administrative leave," Bennett told her, in the same tone he might use to announce they were out of coffee. "Pending investigation." "Pending an investigation based on a false accusation," Claire said. "I understand you feel that way." "I don't feel it. It's factually accurate." She kept her hands still in her lap. "I want the badge log reviewed, the pharmacy camera footage pulled, and I want to know who accessed that cabinet between 6:45 and 7 o'clock. Those requests are being processed." "By whom?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She stood up. "I'll need my suspension in writing." "Claire, in writing," she said again, "with the stated grounds. I'll be in the break room for the next 20 minutes. She walked out of his office and down the hallway, and if her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the break room, she made sure to put them flat on the table before anyone could see. It was in the break room that Holloway found her again. He didn't come alone this time. He brought one of his patrol partners, a younger deputy named Krebs, who was clearly there to serve as a witness or a prop. Claire wasn't sure which. Holloway had a printout in his hand, the pharmacy incident report, and he held it the way some people hold documents when they want you to feel the weight of paper. "Before you go," he said. Claire looked up. "I'm not going anywhere for 20 minutes. We'd like you to come with us." "For what?" "We're going to need a formal statement regarding the controlled substance." "I'll give a formal statement in the presence of legal counsel," Claire said. "Not before." Holloway looked at Krebs. Something passed between them. "Ms. Voss," Holloway said, "this can go one of 2 ways. You cooperate now, and this stays administrative. Or we do it the other way, and it becomes a lot more public and a lot more uncomfortable for you." "Are you arresting me?" A pause. "Not at this time." "Then we're done." She looked back at her phone. 20 minutes. What happened next was the part that the charge nurses and 2 orderlies and a medical student would all later describe in written statements. Holloway stepped forward, put his hand on Claire's arm, and yanked her to her feet. Not dramatically, efficiently, the way someone does when they've done it before, and have decided the situation has escalated to the point where force is an appropriate next step. Claire's phone clattered off the table. Krebs moved to block the door. Holloway walked her backward until she was against the supply room wall, the one just visible through the break room doorway, his forearm coming up across her collarbone, not enough to choke, but enough to pin. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice low, "about how this works when you don't cooperate." She looked at him steadily. Her heart rate was elevated. She was aware of every person standing in the hallway and every camera angle she could recall from the past 3 years of working this floor. "You should know," she said quietly, "that you're being recorded right now by 3 cameras. And you should also know that I have significantly more training than you think I do." He didn't move for a moment. Then he said, "I don't care what training you think you have." "You will," she said. He let go, stepped back. But the damage, or the evidence, depending on how you looked at it, was already done. "Get her out of here," he said to Krebs. "She's suspended. If she tries to re-enter the floor, arrest her." Claire straightened her scrubs. She picked up her phone from the floor. She looked at Holloway one more time and then walked out of the break room without another word. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she was watching the clock, making herself breathe at a normal rate, running through the sequence of events with the systematic precision of someone cataloging a situation rather than experiencing it. The arm against the wall, the camera angles, Krebs in the doorway, Bennett's non-answers, Darla's expression when Holloway mentioned the dilaudid. She pulled out her personal phone, not her hospital-issued one, and made a call. It rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned not to react quickly. "Voss? I need you to know something happened today," she said. A short pause. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Okay." Another pause. "Tell me." She told him. She was precise about the timeline, the names, the physical contact in the break room. She didn't editorialize. She hadn't been trained to editorialize. When she finished, there was silence on the line for a few seconds. "Don't go back in the building today," the man said. "I wasn't planning to. And don't talk to the deputies again without counsel." "Already handled." "Good." A beat. "How are you actually doing?" She looked out at the parking structure's concrete columns, the oil stains, a shopping cart someone had left at the far end. "I'm fine," she said, because she was. Or she would be. She had been through significantly worse than this, and she knew it, which was either a comfort or its own kind of complicated thing. She hadn't decided. "Sit tight," the man said. She ended the call, put the car in reverse, and drove home. The mass casualty alert went out at 2:47 the following afternoon. Claire heard it on the scanner app she kept on her personal phone, a habit from a previous life she'd never quite shed. At first it sounded routine, a vehicle accident on the Route 9 corridor east of Harwick, multiple injuries reported. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a legal pad in front of her, writing out the timeline of the previous day's events in the methodical way she'd been taught to document anything that might eventually need to be explained to someone else. Then the scanner traffic changed. Military unit. Convoy incident. Possible rollover, multiple vehicles. Request for trauma-level response at Calloway General. She was in her car before she finished registering the decision. She knew she was suspended. She knew Holloway had told Krebs to arrest her if she stepped back onto the floor. She also knew, with the specific certainty of someone who had run mass casualty triage in a forward operating environment, that whatever was rolling toward Calloway General was going to overwhelm the trauma staff within minutes of arrival. The ER on a normal Tuesday had 2 attending physicians and a trauma fellow. They had not been trained for what was coming. She drove. The scene outside Calloway General when she arrived was already organized chaos tipping toward the second variety. 3 ambulances were staged at the bay entrance, 2 more incoming. A Harwick PD cruiser was parked sideways across the secondary entrance, and a hospital security guard was standing at the main doors looking like a man who understood that the situation had outgrown him. Claire pulled into a physician's parking space, grabbed the trauma vest she kept in her go-bag in the trunk, and walked through the ambulance bay. Nobody stopped her. Everyone was looking at the same direction, the incoming units, and Claire moved in the opposite vector, in through the side corridor, past the supply staging area, and directly onto the trauma floor. The first thing she saw was Dr. Arav Pillai, the trauma fellow, standing at the central station with his hands on the counter and the particular expression of someone doing a rapid calculation in their head and not liking the result. "You've got approximately 8 minutes before the first wave," Claire said, stepping up beside him. He looked at her. "You're suspended." "Yes," she said. "How many incoming?" He hesitated. He was young, 29, maybe 30, and he'd worked with her long enough to understand that Claire Voss's assessment of a trauma situation had never once been wrong in the time he'd known her. 14 confirmed, he said, possibly more. Military convoy, 3 vehicles went off Route 9 near the grade crossing, 2 rollovers, 1 vehicle fire, suppressed. Burn casualties? At least 3. Claire looked at the board. Where's Dr. Maddox? In surgery, won't be out for 40 minutes minimum. And Dr. Ferraro? Called in, stomach flu. She looked at Pillai. He looked at her. They both knew what that meant. She took a breath. Call Bennett, she said. Tell him you're invoking emergency protocol and you're activating every available resource on the floor. Don't ask. Tell him. Claire, Arav. She said his name flat, not unkind. We have 8 minutes and you have 4 bays set up for 14 patients minimum. Do you want to debate my paperwork or do you want to set up triage? He picked up the phone. She was already moving. The first units arrived in 6 minutes, not 8, and they were worse than the radio had made them sound. The lead ambulance carried 2 soldiers, both male, early 20s, one with a crush injury to the chest from the vehicle rollover, the other with a femoral bleed that had been tourniqueted in the field, but imperfectly. The second unit had 3 more. The third had a soldier who had been pulled from the burning vehicle and had partial thickness burns across his upper arms and face, his airway intact but marginal. Claire moved. She moved the way she had moved in places that had no formal name in any civilian context, in forward positions where the nearest real hospital was an hour away by helicopter, and the work that got done in the first minutes was the difference between a case file and a person. She moved without hesitation, without the performative calm that some trauma staff developed, the visible effort of staying composed, because she wasn't performing anything. She was working. She went to the femoral bleed first. She assessed the tourniquet application, 2 diastole, the medic had placed it wrong, repositioned it in under 12 seconds, called for blood products, and had the soldier's pressure stabilized enough to hand off to a circulating nurse before moving to the chest injury. What's your name? She said to the soldier with the chest injury, because people stayed more alert when someone used them as a person instead of a problem. Decker, he said, through teeth that were tight with pain. Sergeant? Corporal? Sergeant. A breath. First class. Okay, Sergeant Decker. I'm going to listen to your chest. Stay still. She had a stethoscope around her neck and she used it, and what she heard made her straighten immediately. She turned to the nearest nurse. Tension pneumo, right side. I need a 14-gauge needle, midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Now. The nurse moved. Pillai appeared at her shoulder. That's a physician procedure. Yes, she said, and held out her hand for the needle. He gave it to her. The decompression took 40 seconds. Decker's oxygen saturation came up on the monitor. He breathed easier. She was already moving to the next bay. She worked for 37 minutes without stopping. By the end of it, the floor had stabilized into controlled chaos rather than uncontrolled chaos, which was the best anyone could have hoped for given the numbers. 14 patients had become 17. 3 additional walked in from civilian vehicles that had been caught in the convoy incident. And the trauma bays had been managed, the burn casualties were receiving appropriate treatment, and 2 of the most critical patients had been pushed to surgery with enough stabilization to survive transport. Claire was at the supply station washing her hands when she heard the voice behind her. It was rough with pain but coherent, a measured cadence that someone didn't lose just because they'd been through a vehicle rollover. Is that Voss? She turned. The man in Bay 6 was propped up on the gurney with his arm in a temporary splint, a bandage across his forehead, and the uniform of a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He was late 40s, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and a face that looked like it had processed a great deal in its time. She looked at him. He looked at her. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove, she said. I thought you were out, he said. After the Kandahar evac, I thought... He stopped. Everyone thought you were done. I'm a nurse now, she said. He looked around the trauma floor, at the organized aftermath, the patients, the staff, the controlled movement that had replaced the initial chaos. He looked back at her. That's what you've been doing? Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Then, who's the doctor in charge of this floor right now? Technically, Dr. Pillai. Get him, and whoever runs this hospital. He looked at her again with an expression she recognized. Not quite admiration, something older than that. Something that came from having been in situations where the difference between living and dying was a person with the right training making the right call fast enough to matter. Because we need to talk about what just happened in here. Claire looked at him. Outside, through the trauma bay window, she could see the parking lot, and in the parking lot she could now see 3 black military SUVs. She had not been there when she arrived. They had pulled up to the emergency entrance while she was working, and standing outside Bay 4, just inside the ambulance doors, was Deputy Dale Holloway. He had his badge on his belt and his hands on his hips, and the particular expression of a man who had come to enforce something, and who had just walked into a situation he had not remotely prepared for. He saw Claire at the same moment she saw him. She didn't move toward him. She didn't have to. Because 2 of the men who had stepped out of the black SUVs were already walking through the ambulance bay doors, and they were wearing uniforms that outranked everything in that building, and they were walking directly toward her. The 2 men walking through the ambulance bay doors moved the way military men move when they are not in a hurry because they don't need to be, with the particular unhurried confidence of people who understand that their arrival changes the geometry of any room they enter. The first was a full colonel, the eagles on his collar visible from 20 feet, his uniform pressed in a way that suggested he had not been in the vehicle crash. The second was a woman in her early 50s, civilian clothes, a federal badge clipped to her jacket lapel, and the kind of face that gave nothing away voluntarily. She was carrying a leather portfolio and scanning the room with the systematic efficiency of someone who had walked into disasters before and was already categorizing what she found. They stopped in front of Claire. The colonel looked at her for a moment, then at the trauma floor behind her. The organized aftermath, the stabilized patients, the staff still moving with purpose. And something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. Captain Voss, he said. I'm not a captain anymore, Claire said. No, he said. You're not. He extended his hand. Colonel James Whitfield. This is Special Agent Dana Reyes, Army CID. Claire shook his hand. She looked at Reyes, who gave a single nod. We weren't expecting to find you in the middle of a mass casualty response, Whitfield said. We were actually expecting to find you considerably more difficult to locate. I work here, Claire said. We know. Something moved across his face. Or you did. Behind her, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps on linoleum and knew without turning that Bennett had finally appeared. She also heard, closer, the particular sound of someone trying to insert themselves into a conversation they had arrived too late to control. Colonel? Holloway's voice. She had not heard him approach, but here he was, materializing at the edge of the cluster the way he always did, just close enough to be part of things, just far enough to claim he wasn't. Deputy Dale Holloway, Harwick County Sheriff's Department. I can fill you in on the situation with this employee. Whitfield looked at him. I know who you are, Deputy, he said, in the tone of someone closing a door. He turned back to Claire. Is there somewhere we can speak that isn't a trauma bay? Conference room B, Claire said. Down the hall. They walked. Holloway tried to follow. Reyes paused, turned, and said, You'll want to stay on the floor for now, Deputy. With a pleasantness that had nothing pleasant in it, and Holloway stopped walking. Down. Conference room B had a fake ficus in the corner, a whiteboard with someone's medication scheduling notes from 2 days ago, and a long table that sat 12 but currently held 3 people on one side, Claire, Whitfield, Reyes, and an empty chair on the other that nobody had told Bennett to sit in. Bennett was standing near the door, which was either self-awareness or an instinct toward escape routes. Reyes opened the portfolio and set 3 sheets of paper on the table facing Claire. Claire looked at them without picking them up. Photographs. The trauma floor, 45 minutes ago, from the angle of the camera mounted in the upper left corner of the bay entrance. In the first photo, Claire was at the supply station repositioning a tourniquet. In the second, she was at Bay 3 with a needle in her hand and a soldier's vitals climbing on the monitor behind her. In the third, she was directing two nurses with the kind of authoritative economy of motion that didn't read like a nurse running a procedure. It read like something else. Hospital security feeds, Reyes said, live routed to our mobile unit when we arrived on scene. You were watching. We were trying to understand what we walked into, Reyes said. We walked into this. She tapped the photos. Which is not what a suspended nurse typically does. The floor was understaffed and the incoming was severe, Claire said. I made a call. You made several calls, Whitfield said. Good ones. He leaned forward slightly. Sergeant Decker is alive because you decompressed that tension pneumothorax in under 60 seconds. The surgical team just told us that if he'd waited another 4 minutes, that was a non-survivable injury. Claire said nothing. We're not here about the mass casualty response, Reyes said, though we'll be noting it. She pulled another document from the portfolio. We're here because yesterday, a deputy from Harwick County physically assaulted a hospital employee, filed a false controlled substance report against her, and attempted to remove her from the building under threat of arrest. And because that employee has a service record that activated a particular flag in our system when her name came up in a county incident report. Claire looked at the document. Her own service record, the unclassified portions, which were still substantial, her training qualifications, her deployment history. The redacted sections were heavy, and she noticed Whitfield watching her notice them. We weren't sure what we'd find when we came here, he said. We expected to find someone who needed help. I don't need help, Claire said. What you need, Reyes said, with a precision that suggested she'd thought about this exact sentence before saying it, is for the people who created this situation to be held accountable for it. What we need is your cooperation in making that happen. And what this hospital needs, she glanced toward Bennett, who had gone the color of old chalk, is to understand that what happened in that supply room yesterday and what was done with that pharmacy log is now part of a federal investigation. Bennett said very quietly, a federal investigation, Reyes confirmed without looking at him. You'll want to call your legal team. The next 40 minutes were some of the strangest Claire had spent in a long time, and she had a fairly high threshold for strange. Reyes went methodically through the timeline of the previous day, while a CID investigator Claire hadn't seen arrive sat in the corner taking notes. Whitfield periodically asked questions that were brief and precise, the kind of questions that told you the person asking them already knew most of the answer and was checking for consistency rather than information. Claire answered everything. She was not a person who had ever had trouble telling the truth. It was the presentation of the truth that sometimes required management. She told them about the break room, the arm across the collarbone, Krebs in the doorway. She told them about the pharmacy report, about asking for footage and getting silence, about Bennett's non-answers, and the particular expression on Darla Fitch's face. She told it the way she had told it on the phone in the parking structure, precisely, without editorialize, in sequence. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for a moment. The pharmacy camera footage, she said. You requested it. Yes. It exists, Reyes said. We pulled it as part of the federal request. The footage shows no one accessing the controlled substance cabinet under your credentials at 6:52. It shows a male figure, medium build, in scrubs, accessing the cabinet at 7:04 using a card that was run through the system using your badge ID. She paused. Your physical badge was in your possession the entire shift. Yes, Claire said. It was clipped to my lanyard, which means someone either cloned your badge or had access to your credential information and used a secondary card. Reyes made a note. This is not, it turns out, the first time something like this has happened at Calloway General. Something shifted in the room. There are 2 other incident reports, Reyes continued, filed in the past 14 months against nursing staff on this floor, both involving false controlled substance allegations, both resolved through administrative processes rather than investigation, both resulting in the departure of the employee involved. She looked up. We've spoken to both of them this morning, before we came here. Claire looked at her. Who were they? One was a nurse named Patricia Okafor. The other was a tech named Marcus Swan. Reyes said the names with care, like she was placing them somewhere they could be found again. Both of them described the same pattern. A conflict with Deputy Holloway on the floor, a subsequent administrative complaint, A controlled substance irregularity flagged within 24 hours. Suspension. Both of them said they had tried to file grievances and had been told informally that the situation would get worse if they pursued it. The fake ficus in the corner stood very still in the air-conditioned air. Bennett had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the floor. Darla Fitch, Claire said. Yes, Reyes said, and whoever handles the badge system. We have a name, Reyes said, and didn't offer it, which told Claire the investigation had moved further than she'd understood. What I can tell you is that the mechanism for what happened to you is not complicated and not new. It has been used before in this facility. The question is whether it has been used in coordination with outside interests. The county, Claire said. That's one possibility, Reyes said. Whitfield had been quiet for several minutes. Now he spoke. What were you going to do if we hadn't come? Claire considered the question. File a grievance, retain counsel, pull whatever footage I could access through legal channels. Make sure my timeline was documented well enough to survive scrutiny. And Holloway? She looked at him. I wasn't going to touch Holloway. Why not? Because, she said, I've seen what happens when people like him get backed into corners by people who don't have the institutional standing to back them in. It usually goes worse for the person doing the backing. She paused. I know how to wait. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, when your name came across our desk, I pulled your full file, the classified portions. He said it without drama. I read about Kandahar, the Sorobi evacuation, the 26-hour field operation in 2019 that officially didn't happen. No, she said, it didn't. 14 soldiers are alive because of decisions you made in that operation, he said. More than that, she said, and then stopped, because that was more than she usually said. The situation in the hallway outside Conference Room B had apparently evolved while they were inside, which Claire discovered when she opened the door and nearly walked into Dr. Pillai, who was standing in the corridor with his arms crossed, and the specific expression of a man who has been waiting to say something and has now decided he is going to say it. She saved 3 of those soldiers from outcomes that were non-survivable without immediate intervention, he said, directing this at Whitfield, who had emerged behind Claire. I want that on the record. It's noted, Whitfield said. She was suspended under false pretenses, Pillai continued. I should have said something yesterday and I didn't. He looked at Claire. I'm sorry. Claire looked at him. Arav Pillai was not a man who apologized easily or unnecessarily. She had worked with him long enough to know that. You did the right thing today, she said. I did the minimum, he said. They stood in the hallway and it was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was something. What happened next happened fast, which in Claire's experience was how the important things almost always went. The CID team moved through Calloway General with the focused efficiency of people who had been building toward this moment before they ever arrived. They requested the badge system logs, the pharmacy camera archive, the security footage from the break room and the supply room corridor, and the administrative record of every complaint filed against nursing staff in the preceding 2 years. They did this without raising their voices, without making dramatic pronouncements, presenting federal authorization documents that rendered every administrative objection immediately moot. Darla Fitch, who had tried to go home at her regular 4 o'clock, was intercepted at the parking structure exit and asked to return to the building. She sat with a CID investigator for over an hour and came out of that meeting looking like a woman who had made several decisions in the past 24 months that she was now comprehensively regretting. Holloway had been in the ER waiting area for most of this. Claire knew because she had passed the waiting room twice and seen him there, still in uniform, his patrol partner Krebs gone, alone with his phone and a cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold. He wasn't pacing. He was sitting still with the particular stillness of a man running calculations. She did not look at him for longer than it took to register his presence. What she was doing, for most of the afternoon, was sitting with Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove. He was in Bay 6, arm splinted, forehead sutured, waiting on a transfer to the military medical facility in Tucson that had been arranged through channels Claire wasn't fully briefed on. How was, if not comfortable, alert, and he wanted to talk. Not about the crash. He'd been through crash debriefs before and would go through this one in the proper setting, but about Claire, with the specific directness of a senior officer who had decided that something needed to be said and was going to say it. When you separated, he said, there were people who thought it was a waste. I know, she said. I was one of them. She looked at him. I should have said something different than I did when you put in your papers, he said. I didn't. I was busy and I thought you'd change your mind, and I handled it badly. He shifted in the gurney and made a face at what that cost him. I've thought about it a few times since. You didn't owe me anything, Claire said. Professionally, no. But I knew what you'd done and I knew why you were leaving and I should have… He stopped. It doesn't matter now. It doesn't, she agreed, not unkindly. You're wasting yourself, he said, as a floor nurse. She considered that. I've saved lives on this floor, she said. 4 years of them. I know. And today. And today. He looked at her with the gravity of someone who meant what they were about to say. Which is exactly my point, Voss. You don't cease to be what you are because you changed locations. She didn't have an answer for that, or she had one, but it was complicated and it belonged to a longer conversation than this bay was suited for. She said, Get some sleep before the transfer, and stood up. He let her go. But he watched her walk away the way people watch things they intend to make sure aren't lost. At 6:17 in the evening, Reyes found Claire in the staff kitchen on the ground floor, the one that wasn't technically for medical staff, the one maintenance used, which meant it was quiet, and the coffee was always fresh because maintenance kept irregular hours and valued their caffeine. Reyes poured herself a cup without asking, sat down across the table, and said, We have a problem. Claire waited. The badge cloning wasn't done inside this facility, Reyes said. The system logs show a remote access event. Someone pulled your credential data from an external point and used it to generate a secondary badge. That's not something a hospital administrator with access to the badge system does on their own. That requires a particular skill set, and more relevantly, a particular motivation. Holloway, Claire said. Not Holloway directly, but someone in his network. Reyes set down her cup. We've been looking at Holloway for 6 months, not because of this hospital, because of a pattern in county incident reports. Cases where individuals who had filed complaints against his conduct found themselves subsequently facing unrelated criminal allegations that never quite made it to prosecution, but were enough to discredit the complainant. It's a specific technique. You threaten with it, and then you don't follow through because the follow-through would require scrutiny. He does it to intimidate, Claire said, not to prosecute. Correct. And it works, because most of the people he targets don't have the resources or the standing to fight it, and walking away is less costly than staying. Reyes looked at her steadily. You were supposed to walk away. Claire looked at her cup. I know. But you came back to this building. There were soldiers incoming and the floor was short. Yes, Reyes said, and in doing so you ended up in a room with a lieutenant colonel who knows your service history, in front of federal investigators who had already flagged Holloway's name 6 months ago. Reyes paused. Sometimes the problem is the thing that ends the problem. That's a generous reading, Claire said. It's an accurate one. Reyes pulled a document from her portfolio, a single page, set face down on the table. I need to show you something, and I need you to look at it without reacting visibly, because we're in a building with a county deputy down the hall, and I'd prefer he doesn't know what we know yet. Claire turned the page over. It was a financial document, routing numbers, transaction records, amounts that were not large enough to attract immediate attention individually, but were consistent enough over time to tell a story. She recognized the account name at the top, a property management company. She looked at Reyes. Holloway has a financial interest in 3 properties in East Harwick, Reyes said quietly. Properties where, for the past 26 months, code enforcement violations have been filed and then quietly closed. Properties that are rented at rates that require a certain flexibility in who can afford them and why. She let that sit for a moment. The network we've been building toward isn't just about intimidating complainants, Voss. The intimidation was the protection mechanism for something larger. Claire set the page face down again with deliberate care. How large, she said. Large enough, Reyes said, that when the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix gets our call tonight, they're going to have been waiting for it. The maintenance kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. A cart rattled past on the linoleum. Normal sounds, against which the thing Reyes had just said sat with the density of something that didn't fit in a normal day. What do you need from me? Claire said. Reyes looked at her. Your statement, your timeline, every interaction you had with Holloway, in sequence, with as much specificity as you can provide. She paused. And I need you to understand that what you're about to be part of is not small, and it is not going to be quiet, and there are people who are going to try to say things about you when it goes public. People have said things about me before, Claire said. Not at this scale. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, Okafor and Swan, she said. Patricia and Marcus. Are they being included in this? Reyes looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. Yes, she said. Their cases are part of the filing. Good, Claire said. Then tell me where to start. She pulled the legal pad she'd brought from her kitchen table, the one with yesterday's timeline already written on it, and set it between them. Reyes looked at the pad, at the careful, precise handwriting, the numbered sequence of events, the timestamps. You started documenting last night, Reyes said. Yes. Before you knew we were coming. Yes. Reyes looked at her for a moment. I'm starting to understand, she said, why Hargrove's file on you is the length it is. Claire uncapped her pen. Where do you want to begin? They were still at the table 40 minutes later when Claire's phone, sitting face up between them, lit up with a text from a number she didn't immediately recognize. She looked at it. 4 words, no punctuation, the kind of message that had been written in a hurry by someone who was not in the habit of texting but had decided the situation warranted it. They're moving the records. Claire looked up at Reyes. Reyes was already reaching for her radio. Reyes was on the radio before Claire had finished reading the text a second time. She used clipped, specific language, unit designations, location codes, the kind of shorthand that meant she'd been coordinating with people outside the building long before she walked into conference room B. Claire sat still and let her work, because inserting herself into someone else's operational moment was a habit she'd trained out of herself years ago. Which records? Reyes said, radio down, looking at Claire's phone. Did the text specify? No? Do you know the number? No. Claire looked at it again. Harwick area code. Prepaid, probably, given the format. Someone inside the building, or someone watching it. Or both. Reyes stood. Stay here. She was gone before Claire could respond, which meant Claire was left alone in the maintenance kitchen with a legal pad full of her own handwriting and a text message from a number that didn't exist in her contacts. She looked at the text for a moment longer. Then she picked up her phone and typed back a single word. Which department? She set the phone face up on the table and waited. 30 seconds. A minute. The phone stayed dark. Then it lit up. Administration. 3rd floor. Fitch's office. Someone's been in there since 5. Claire was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to stand. She didn't go up to the 3rd floor. She wasn't supposed to be in the building at all, technically. And walking into an active federal evidence situation without authorization was the kind of decision that felt justified in the moment and created serious problems afterward. She knew this from experience. Instead, she went to the 2nd floor landing, the stairwell that connected to the 3rd floor corridor, and she stood at the door with her hand on the bar and waited, which was significantly harder than going through the door would have been. What she heard was movement. More than one person, the kind of footfall that came from 2 or 3 individuals who were trying to be quiet but were carrying something. A door. The particular click and drag of a cabinet drawer being opened and not quite closed. Then voices, low, male, a tone that wasn't conversation but coordination. And then Reyes's voice clearly from the far end of the corridor. Federal investigators, stop moving. A beat of silence, then running. Not toward the stairwell, toward the north corridor, which was the longer route but connected to the service elevator. Claire pushed through the door and came out into the 3rd floor hallway. At the same moment, one of them came around the corner at a full run. He was wearing scrubs, not staff scrubs, the wrong shade, the wrong fit, the small details that read wrong if you'd spent 4 years looking at the real thing. And he was carrying a manila folder thick enough to be a substantial portion of someone's filing system. He stopped when he saw her. She was in the middle of the corridor, and he had committed to the momentum, and she was not moving, which was the thing that gave him approximately 1 second of miscalculation. She stepped into him, got her weight behind his shoulder, redirected his momentum without stopping it, and put him into the wall in a controlled way that took both his balance and his ability to hold the folder simultaneously. The folder hit the floor. Paper spread across the linoleum in a half circle. He tried to stand. She kept her hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't," in the tone of someone who means it without needing to elaborate. He didn't. Reyes came around the corner 30 seconds later with a CID agent behind her and took in the scene. Claire, the man in the wrong scrubs, the scattered papers, with the particular expression of someone who is recalibrating what they thought they knew about the person standing in front of them. "I told you to stay in the kitchen," Reyes said. "You did," Claire said. "And yet." He was heading for the service elevator. Reyes looked at the papers on the floor. She crouched, looked at the top sheet without touching it, and said something under her breath that wasn't quite a word. She stood up. "Get him," she said to the CID agent, who already had cuffs out. Claire stepped back and let the process happen around her. Her shoulder was going to ache tomorrow. She'd hit the wall at an angle that wasn't ideal, and her heart rate was elevated in a way she was already working to bring down. She looked at the papers without touching them. They were personnel files. Her name was on the top sheet of one of them. Below hers, Okafor's. Below that, a name she didn't recognize but would shortly. What the papers represented, as Reyes explained it 40 minutes later in a conference room now populated by 4 additional CID agents and a woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office who had driven from Phoenix in what must have been record time, was a purge. Someone, multiple someones, it now appeared, had identified that the federal request for records was broader than expected, had accessed Darla Fitch's administrative files, and had attempted to remove the physical documentation that would show the pattern of false reports. The man in the wrong scrubs was not hospital staff. He was, it emerged, a contract employee of a property management firm. One of the 3 properties on Reyes's financial document. "So he's connected to Holloway's network," Claire said. "Directly," Reyes said. "His employment records show a gap in 2022 that corresponds to a period when he was working under a shell company that we've been tracing for 8 months. She paused. "This is moving faster than we anticipated because of the convoy incident. If your vehicle hadn't come through today, this investigation would have continued at its original pace for another 3 or 4 months. The convoy crash changed the timeline," Claire said. "The convoy crash brought federal personnel to this facility, which meant when we ran the standard pre-arrival check on local incidents involving our personnel." She stopped. "Your incident flag came up?" Claire looked at the window. It was full dark outside now, the parking lot lit in sodium orange, and she could see the 3 black SUVs still staged at the emergency entrance. What she could also see, because the conference room was on the 2nd floor and the waiting area was visible from a certain angle, was the top of Holloway's head. I was still there. He'd been there for 4 hours. Something about that, the waiting, the stillness, was more unnerving than if he'd been agitated. "He knows something's wrong," Claire said. "He's been in the waiting room for 4 hours. Reyes followed her line of sight. "Yes," she said. "We've been aware." "Is he going to run?" "He'd have done it already if he was going to," Reyes said. "He's calculating. He thinks there might still be a version of this where he comes out intact." She said it with clinical detachment, the way a person talks about a process rather than a person. "There isn't, Dad. The thing about hospitals at night was that they didn't go quiet. They changed registers." The day shift chaos thinned into a different kind of motion, slower, more deliberate, the particular sounds of an institution, running on a reduced crew and managing accordingly. Claire knew this rhythm. She had worked night shifts here. She had worked nights in forward positions where the sounds were entirely different, but the principle was the same. A smaller set of people managing a larger set of problems, with less margin and less backup. She walked the floor at 9 o'clock because no one had told her not to, and because the patients were still there regardless of what was happening in the administrative wing, and because she was a person who had difficulty being still when there were things that needed doing. She wasn't intervening in care, the night staff knew their patients, but she checked the soldiers still occupying 3 of the trauma bays, spoke briefly to a night nurse named Thomas, who had been covering since 6, and who looked like a man held together by caffeine and obligation, and stopped at the bay where the burn patient from the convoy was now sedated and stable. He was young, 22 maybe. His arms were wrapped, his face treated, his oxygen levels within acceptable parameters. He would need grafting. He would need months of recovery. He would carry the marks of this for the rest of his life, and he would probably not think of it as the thing that ended him, because people who had been through things tended to have a longer view of what ending looked like. Claire stood at the foot of his bed for a moment, not doing anything, just being present in the specific way that sometimes mattered in a room with someone who couldn't feel it. Then she went back to the second floor. The situation changed at 10:43. Reyes called her back into the conference room, now rearranged, more people present. The woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office, at the head of the table, with a laptop open and an expression of intense concentration. Her name was Adrienne Cho, and she had the quality of focus that some people developed when they worked in high-stakes environments long enough. Not intensity exactly, more like precision, everything directed toward the thing that mattered and nothing wasted. "We have a problem," Cho said, which was the second time in this building someone had opened with that sentence today. "The financial records we pulled on the property management company have a third party. Not Holloway. Not the shell company we've been tracking." She turned the laptop. "A county administrator, Ellis Pruitt, Deputy Director of Code Enforcement." The name landed in the room like something dropped on a hard floor. "Pruitt has been the one closing the code violations," Reyes said. "We knew that. What we didn't know was that he also had access to the county's law enforcement database and has been running background checks on individuals who filed complaints against Holloway for the past 2 years." She paused. "Including Claire." Claire looked at the laptop. Her own record, the civilian portion, was on the screen. Below it, a query log. Multiple searches on her name. The most recent one was time-stamped at 4:17 this afternoon, after the military vehicles arrived, after Holloway had been sitting in the waiting room for 2 hours. "He was looking for something to use," Claire said. "He was looking for a way out," Cho said. "Whatever he found, he sent to Holloway." 40 minutes after this search, Holloway made a phone call to his union rep. She closed the laptop. The union rep has a relationship with a county commissioner who sits on the oversight board for the sheriff's department. She looked at Reyes. "Which means if we don't move tonight, there is a real possibility that by tomorrow morning this has become a political situation rather than a criminal one." The room went quiet with the particular quality of people understanding that the window was narrowing. "How much do we have?" Reyes said. "What I'm about to do is going to be loud. I want you to understand that before it happens." "What are you doing tonight?" Claire said. "We're arresting Holloway," Cho said, "and Pruitt, and we're serving a simultaneous warrant on the property management company's offices." She paused. "In a hospital, in front of staff and patients, at 10:45 at night. It will be on the news by midnight." Claire took that in. "What about Fitch?" "She's cooperating," Reyes said, "since 6 o'clock. In exchange for reduced charges, she's given us the name of the staff member who cloned your badge, the procedural mechanism they used, and documentation of 2 additional false reports that were created but not deployed." She paused. "Insurance policies, essentially." Claire said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about Patricia Okafor and Marcus Swan, who had left this building under clouds that were now about to be lifted. She was thinking about Gerald Pruitt in Bay 4 yesterday morning, looking at Holloway with that tight jaw. She was thinking about Sergeant Decker, whose chest she had decompressed while all of this was still just a bad shift on a suspended employee's record. "Okay," she said. Cho looked at her. "You understand that your name is going to be in everything that comes out of tonight?" "Yes." "And you're prepared for that?" Claire looked at her steadily. "Ms. Cho," she said, "I spent 4 years trying to be invisible in this building because it was easier than the alternative. I think the alternative just arrived." Cho held her gaze for a second, then she nodded and stood up. The arrest happened in the ER waiting room at 11:08. Claire was not present for it. She was in the hallway off the main corridor, close enough to hear the sequence of events, but not positioned where anyone could later say she had been there to watch it happen, because she was aware that the optics of things mattered, and she had no interest in appearing vindictive. She was there because she was waiting for Reyes, who had told her to stay close. What she heard was Cho's voice, measured and clear. Then Whitfield's. Then Holloway's voice. The first time it had been raised since the break room yesterday, a sound that ricocheted off the waiting room walls and reached the hallway as something between shock and calculation pivoting into something rawer. She heard the specific language of an arrest being formally made. She heard Krebs, who had apparently returned to the building in the past hour, try to say something and be stopped by a CID agent before he got the third word out. Then she heard something she hadn't expected. Applause. Not much, not loud. 3 or 4 people in the waiting room, patients or family members who had been sitting there for hours and who had watched enough to form an opinion about the deputy who had been occupying the corner chairs. Tomas came around the corner from the nurse's station, looked at Claire, and said nothing. He just raised both eyebrows. She raised one back. He went back to his station. Reyes found her 2 minutes later. Pruitt is being picked up at his residence, she said. The warrant team is at the property management office. She looked at Claire. It's moving. Yes, Claire said. How are you doing? It was the second time someone had asked her that today, and both times it had been phrased the same way. Not, are you okay, which invited performance, but the open version, which didn't. I'll let you know when I've had time to think about it, she said. Reyes nodded. That was apparently an acceptable answer. Well, what Claire had not been prepared for was Bennett. He found her at 11:30 in the stairwell between the second and third floors, which was where she had gone to be in a space with no cameras and no people for 5 minutes. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her, and he looked like a man who had aged several years since that morning. The soft, evasive quality he usually carried, the quality that made him useful to people like Holloway and harmful to people like Claire, was gone. What was left was not impressive, but it was more honest. I need to say something to you, he said. She looked at him from the landing. Okay. I knew, he said, about Okafor, not the details. But when it happened, He stopped. I knew something wasn't right and I let it go because making it into something would have been difficult, and it was easier to... He stopped again. Believe what you were presented, Claire said. I chose to believe it, he said. That's different. She looked at him for a long moment. He was right about that. The distinction was real, and it mattered. Yes, she said. It is. I don't expect you to. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, she said. It isn't, but I'm also not going to make it the center of what this was. She came down 2 steps. Patricia Okafor left her profession because of what happened in this building. Marcus Swan moved out of state. Whatever you say to me tonight, say it to them first. He looked at the floor, nodded. She came the rest of the way down the stairs and walked past him, because she had said what was true, and anything more would have been for his comfort rather than the record. At 12:40 in the morning, Reyes knocked on the staff kitchen door, the maintenance one, which had become the unofficial headquarters of Claire's participation in the evening, and set a document on the table. Your suspension, she said, has been formally revoked as of 11:58. Bennett signed it 10 minutes ago with Cho present as a witness. She pushed the document forward. Your record at this facility has been cleared. The controlled substance allegation is formally withdrawn. It'll take administrative processing to make it official on paper, but the investigative determination is already in. Claire looked at the document. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. What she felt was something more complicated. The absence of a weight she had been carrying, which was its own sensation, the presence of something that needed time to identify properly. Okafor and Swan, she said. Their cases are part of the federal filing, Reyes said. Their employment records at this hospital will be corrected. Whether they want to return to nursing is their decision. Claire nodded. There's something else, Reyes said. She sat down. This was only the second time she had sat down in Claire's presence all day, and both times it had preceded something significant. Whitfield wants to speak with you in the morning, formally. There's a program. I can't give you the specifics tonight, but your service record and what you did on that floor today have put your name in front of people who have the authority to ask you certain questions. What kind of questions? Claire said. The kind that start with what you want to do next, Reyes said. Claire looked at the revocation document on the table in front of her. The document that said she could go back to the job she'd built in the years since she'd left the thing she'd been before. The document that said the people who had tried to erase her had failed. I need to sleep, she said, before I answer anything like that. That's reasonable, Reyes said. They sat in the maintenance kitchen with their coffee for another few minutes, and the building around them was doing what buildings did after the significant events, settling, resettling, absorbing what had happened into its structure the way a place absorbs everything that occurs inside it over enough time. Then Reyes's phone rang. She looked at it. Whatever expression she'd had arranged was replaced by something sharper and less composed. "What?" she said into the phone. A pause. Claire watched her face. "How long ago?" Another pause. "Is he—" She stopped, listened, stood up from the table in a single motion, her coffee forgotten. "I'll be there in 4 minutes." She ended the call and looked at Claire with the specific look of someone whose operational plan has just developed a critical complication. "Holloway's patrol vehicle is missing from the county impound," she said. "It was signed out at 11:45 by a deputy whose credentials check out, except that deputy has been on medical leave for 3 weeks." She was already moving toward the door. "And Pruitt never made it to the pickup. The warrant team found his house empty." Claire stood. "The arrest tonight," Reyes said, stopping in the doorway, "was only Holloway, and Holloway made a phone call before they cuffed him." She looked at Claire. "We need to know who he called." She was gone before the door finished closing, her footsteps already at the end of the corridor. Claire stood in the empty maintenance kitchen, the revocation document on the table in front of her, and thought about what it meant that Pruitt had run and that someone with the right credentials had pulled Holloway's vehicle from impound at 11:45, 3 minutes after the arrest in the waiting room. It meant the network was not as broken as tonight had made it look. It meant someone still outside that building had known, in real time, what was happening inside it. She picked up her phone. The anonymous number was still on screen. She typed, "Are you in the building?" The response came back in under 10 seconds. "I was. I'm not now. You need to check who's been in the radiology bay on the East Wing for the past 2 hours. The man in there isn't a patient." Claire read the text twice, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because she was already moving and she needed her mind working on the East Wing's layout rather than the words on the screen. Radiology was on the ground floor, East Corridor, accessible from the main building through a connecting hallway that most of the evening staff used as a shortcut to the parking structure. At this hour, the department was closed. No scheduled imaging, skeleton staffing, one tech on overnight for emergency orders only. She typed back, "How long have you known?" No response this time. She pocketed the phone and went through the stairwell door. The ground floor East Corridor at 12:50 in the morning had the specific quality of a building running on minimum. Every third light on, the floor cleaner still wet in patches. Near the radiology entrance, a single chair outside the imaging suite where the overnight tech should have been sitting. The chair was empty. The door to the radiology reception area was propped open with a rubber wedge, which was not the protocol for a closed department. Claire stopped 6 feet from the door and listened. She heard breathing, controlled, deliberate, someone who was trying to keep their respiration quiet and had enough training to mostly manage it. She also heard, under that, the specific sound of a phone call in progress at low volume. Not the words, just the cadence. One-sided, someone receiving information. She took out her phone and texted Reyes. "East Wing Radiology, ground floor, now, quiet approach." She didn't wait for the confirmation. She went through the door. The radiology reception area was dim, only the exit signs and one desk lamp left on. The desk was empty. The door to the imaging suite itself was closed. The door to the secondary corridor, the one that connected to the file storage room and the staff bathroom, was open, and the breathing and the phone call were coming from there. She walked to the doorway and looked in. The man in the secondary corridor was not a patient. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs extended, wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark pants, the kind of neutral outfit that worked in parking lots and corridors after midnight. He was in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since arranged itself into something that worked harder. He had a phone to his ear and a small laptop open on his knees, and he was looking directly at her when she came around the corner, which meant he had heard her and had decided staying put was better than moving. He lowered the phone. "Ms. Voss," he said. She looked at him. She didn't know his face, but she knew the type. County administration, middle management, the layer of person who processed the decisions that people like Holloway made in the field and translated them into paperwork that looked like procedure. "Ellis Pruitt," she said. He said nothing. Your warrant team found your house empty, she said. You've been here the whole time. I work with this hospital, he said. Code compliance. I'm here regularly. At 1 a.m, I had documents to retrieve. She looked at the laptop on his knees, at his phone, at the staff bathroom door behind him, which was closed. Who's in the bathroom? She said. A beat. No one. She looked at the bathroom door for 2 seconds. Then she looked back at him. Stand up and step away from the laptop. You don't have the authority. I have a federal investigator 30 seconds away who does, she said. Stand up. He stood. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down, and his posture had a particular quality, not threatening, but assessing, the way someone stands when they haven't decided yet which version of this situation they're going to commit to. He took 2 steps to his left, which put him slightly closer to the reception area door, which she noted. The bathroom door opened. The man who came out was younger, mid-30s, compact build, moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had made a decision before he came through the door. He had his hands visible, which was deliberate, and told her he wanted her to see that he wasn't holding anything. He also had the look of someone who had been on the other side of tense situations before and understood that the first 30 seconds of any confrontation were the ones that determined what the next 30 minutes looked like. She recognized him. Deputy Krebs. Holloway's patrol partner. The one who had blocked the break room door while Holloway had her pinned against the wall. He stopped when he saw her expression. I'm not here for you, he said. You're in a closed apartment at 1 a.m, she said, with a man who has a federal warrant outstanding. What exactly are you here for? I'm here, he said carefully, because I made a phone call 2 hours ago from an unregistered number. The maintenance kitchen. The anonymous text. She looked at him. You sent me the messages, she said. Yes. She looked at Pruitt, at Krebs. The geometry of the corridor rearranged itself in her understanding. You were the one who told me about the records being moved. Someone had to, Krebs said. And I couldn't walk up to the federal agents because Holloway doesn't know I've been building a case on him for 8 months. He said it without drama, just the flat statement of someone laying out a situation. If I surface now, with the wrong framing, my information gets buried in the politics of what happened tonight. Your county law enforcement working against your own partner, she said. My own partner, Krebs said, has been running a protection racket through the county code office and using this hospital as a mechanism for silencing anyone who could testify against him. I've been documenting it since last February. He looked at Pruitt. And I followed him here tonight because he called Holloway after the arrest. I was the one who pulled the phone records. Holloway's call before they cuffed him, Claire said. 37 seconds, Krebs said. Long enough to say 2 things, where the backup documentation was kept and who to call. Pruitt had gone very still. The vehicle from impound, Claire said. Wasn't for Holloway, Krebs said. Holloway's in federal custody. The vehicle was for whoever he called. Someone who was supposed to collect whatever Pruitt pulled from the hospital records tonight and make sure it didn't make it to the investigators. He looked at Pruitt again, and this time there was something in the look that was not purely professional. Who did he call? Pruitt said nothing. Reyes came through the reception area door at that moment with 2 CID agents behind her, took in the corridor, Pruitt against the wall, Krebs with his hands visible, Claire standing between them, and said, with the precision of someone who had learned to read rooms very fast, I need everyone to not move. Nobody moved. It took 40 minutes to sort out the architecture of the situation, who Krebs was, what he had, why he was in the corridor, and how the anonymous text connected to the evening's events. Reyes ran it herself, in the conference room, with Cho on the phone from her car in the parking lot. Claire sat in on the first 20 minutes and then was asked to wait outside, which was appropriate given the operational nature of what Krebs was describing. She waited in the second-floor corridor and looked out the window at the parking lot below. The 3 black SUVs were still staged. A 4th vehicle had arrived sometime in the past hour. Unmarked, federal plates, backed into the corner spot the way people park when they want to be able to leave quickly. She watched a figure cross the parking lot, hands in jacket pockets, moving without hurry. At the entrance, the figure stopped, looked up. She couldn't see the face clearly, but something about the posture, the particular stillness before a decision, made the back of her neck register something that it took her a moment to identify. The figure went inside. 3 minutes later, her phone rang. Unknown number. Not the prepaid, a different one. She answered it. Ms. Voss? A man's voice. Unhurried, slightly northern accent, suppressed but present. I understand you've had an eventful evening. She said nothing. I also understand that Deputy Krebs has been talking to the federal investigators for the past half hour, the voice said. Which is unfortunate because Deputy Krebs knows a significant amount about a significant number of people, and some of those people are going to want to know exactly how much he's said. Who is this? She said. That's not the productive question, the voice said. The productive question is whether you'd like to spend the next several months in depositions and federal proceedings, or whether there's a version of this that ends tonight with your record cleared and your life returned to something that resembles normal. She looked at the window, the parking lot, the unmarked vehicle in the corner spot. You're offering me something, she said. I'm suggesting, the voice said, that a conversation between us in the next 15 minutes might be worth more to you than anything the investigators are going to offer. The investigators have already offered me full revocation of the suspension and cleared documentation, she said. What are you offering that's better than that? A pause. Continued employment, stability, and the assurance that this doesn't become the kind of public incident that follows a person for years. The arrest of a county deputy is already on the news, she said. It's 12:50 in the morning and it's already on the news. How do you propose to manage the public incident that's already public? Ms. Voss, you're in the building, she said. The parking lot. You came in 3 minutes ago. You're somewhere in this building right now and you're calling me from 30 feet away. She kept her voice level. Whoever you are, you made a mistake tonight. You should have been further away when you made this call. The line went dead. She walked immediately to the conference room door and knocked twice, the sequence she and Reyes had established 2 hours ago. The door opened. She looked at Reyes and said, Someone just tried to make a deal with me by phone. Unknown number, male voice. He's in this building right now. He came in through the main entrance at approximately 12:53. Reyes turned to the CID agent at the table. 3 words. Lock the building. On. The lockdown of Calloway General at 1 in the morning was not dramatic in the way that lockdowns in films were dramatic. It was quiet and systematic. Exits secured, security personnel repositioned. The overnight staff briefed in 30-second increments as agents moved through the floor. Night patients stayed in their rooms. The skeleton crew moved to Central Station and stayed there. The building folded inward and became smaller, and the people who were in it were now the only people in it. Krebs, once the CID team understood what he had and confirmed enough of it to establish his credibility, became something between an asset and a witness. He sat at the conference room table with his documentation, 8 months of it, organized on a personal drive he'd been keeping off the county system, photographs and call logs and financial records assembled with the patience of someone who had understood that impatience would get him killed, and worked through it with Reyes and Cho while 2 agents ran the building. Claire, for the second time in 12 hours, was in the maintenance kitchen. This time she wasn't waiting to give a statement. She was writing. She had her legal pad and a pen, and she was reconstructing the phone call. Every word, the accent, the specific phrasing, the things that told her something about who had made it. The offer of stability. The framing of continued employment, which presupposed she was currently employed, which she technically wasn't until the revocation paperwork processed. Which meant whoever had called knew about the revocation before it was finalized, which meant they had a source inside tonight's proceedings. She wrote all of this down. Then she wrote, The call came 30 seconds after the figure entered the building. If he's still in the building, he is not on the lobby-level floors. Agents cleared those in the first 5 minutes of lockdown. He went up or he went down. Down was utilities and storage. Up was administration. She picked up the legal pad and went to find Reyes. What Reyes told her, in the brief 45-second window between operational tasks, was that the building sweep had found the lobby, the first floor, the second floor, and the emergency department all clear. Third floor was in progress. Utilities had 2 agents. The parking structure was being handled by a Harwick PD unit that Cho had called in. Not Holloway's department, a different jurisdiction, the kind of call that happened when you needed local support, but had reason to be selective about which local. What the parking structure unit found, in the northeast stairwell connecting the structure to the hospital's administrative wing, was not the unknown caller. It was Ellis Pruitt's laptop, left on a step, open, still running, the browser history wiped, but the VPN connection still active, routing through a commercial service that the CID tech was already working to trace. The laptop had been there long enough for the screen to dim, but not long enough to lock. Whatever Pruitt had been accessing when Claire walked into that corridor, someone had retrieved and left the device. Which meant two things. Pruitt had not been working alone in that corridor, and whoever the second person was had moved the critical data before the building locked down. Claire read the agent's report summary in the hallway outside the conference room and felt the specific sensation of a situation that had been almost closed opening back up in a way that required recalibration. The data that Pruitt pulled from Fitch's files, she said to Reyes, who was standing 4 feet away with her phone in her hand. Was it only personnel records? Reyes looked at her. No. What else? Transaction records, Reyes said. Between the property management company and a county discretionary fund that was supposed to be allocated for infrastructure maintenance. She paused. 11 months of it, roughly $300,000 in misdirected funds. And if that documentation disappears, Claire said, the financial case gets substantially harder, Reyes said. We still have enough for the assault charges, the misconduct, but the RICO component, she stopped. Is what makes this a federal case rather than a local one, Claire said. Yes. They looked at each other in the hallway, and what passed between them was the understanding that the evening had been a partial victory and was in danger of becoming a partial failure, and that partial failures in situations like this had a way of getting worse before anyone found out how much worse. The VPN, Claire said. The laptop. Someone had access to Pruitt's session before we found the device. If they downloaded the transaction records through that connection before the VPN dropped, they'd have a copy, Reyes said, and we'd have the original case minus the piece that makes it federal. She was already typing on her phone. I need the tech on that VPN trace now. She walked. Claire stood in the hallway and looked at the ceiling. Not helplessly, but the way she used to stand in the seconds before an operation went into its active phase, taking one breath that was longer than the others, running the known variables, accepting that the unknown ones would present themselves when they did. She took out her phone and opened the message thread with the anonymous number. The last text from Krebs had been, "The man in there isn't a patient." She scrolled up, looked at the sequence. The text about the records being moved had come at 12:41, which was 3 minutes after she and Reyes had finished their conversation in the maintenance kitchen, which meant Krebs had known about the records being moved before they'd found the man in the wrong scrubs in the corridor, which meant Krebs had been watching the administrative wing before the federal agents got there. She went back to the conference room and knocked. The door opened. Krebs was still at the table. The record's being moved, she said. You texted me at 12:41. How long had you known before you sent that? He looked at her. Maybe 20 minutes. How did you know? I was in the stairwell on the 3rd floor, he said. I'd followed Pruitt in at around 8 o'clock. I watched him access Fitch's office. Fitch cooperated with the investigators from 6 o'clock onward, Claire said. She was interviewed for over an hour. Her office should have been flagged. Something shifted in Krebs's expression. Should have been, he said. But Pruitt was in her office from approximately 8 o'clock, she said, and the federal request for Fitch's administrative records wasn't executed until approximately 9:30. She looked at Reyes, who had turned from her phone. Someone told Pruitt about the scope of the records request before it was formally executed, in that 90-minute window. The conference room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the implication of a thing arrives before the words describing it do. Fitch, Reyes said. Or someone Fitch talked to between 6 and 8, Claire said. She was cooperating, but cooperating doesn't mean isolated. Did she have her phone? Reyes looked at the CID agent at the end of the table, who was already pulling up a log. A pause. Then, she made 2 calls during the interview break at 7:45, both to numbers in her contacts. Which numbers? Reyes said. The agent read them out. The second one landed in the room like something landing from a height. It was the same number Holloway had called for 37 seconds before they cuffed him. The person Fitch and Holloway had both called was a man named Raymond Stoll, who held the position of Deputy Director of Administrative Services for Harwick County, a position that, as Cho explained from her laptop in the next 30 minutes, gave him oversight authority over 4 county departments, access to the county's discretionary budget, and a professional relationship with every major institution in the county going back 11 years, including Calloway General, where he sat on the hospital's external advisory board, including the sheriff's department, whose budget requests went through his office, including the property management company, where a search of state business filings showed him listed as a registered agent under a name that required 2 layers of LLC structure to find. Krebs had the LLC filings in his documentation. He found them in under 4 minutes and put them on the table without saying anything, which was more effective than saying something would have been. "He's the one who called me," Claire said, "from inside the building." Cho looked at her. "You're certain?" "The phrasing of the offer, continued employment, stability. Those are administrative euphemisms, not law enforcement language." She looked at the advisory board documentation on Cho's laptop. "He sits on this hospital's advisory board. He used board-level language." "He'd have the authority to influence the hospital's employment decisions," Cho said, almost to herself. "Which is what he was offering," Claire said. "He thought if he could pull me out of the federal proceedings, he could reduce the evidentiary trail." She paused. "He doesn't know I already gave my full statement. He doesn't know the timeline is already on paper." Cho looked at Reyes. Something passed between them that was a decision made without words. Reyes picked up her radio. They found Raymond Stoll in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 4th floor, the one used for board meetings, which he had accessed with his advisory board keycard at 1:17 in the morning. He was sitting at the head of the table with a phone in his hand and a leather briefcase beside the chair, and when the CID agents came through the door, he set the phone down on the table with the deliberate care of a man deciding how the next 5 minutes were going to define the rest of his life. He chose to remain calm. This told Claire something about him. Not that he was innocent, but that he was experienced, the kind of person who had been in difficult situations before and understood that the first thing you surrendered when you panicked was options. "I'd like my attorney," he said. "You'll have that opportunity," Cho said. "Right now I need you to tell me where the data is." "I don't know what you're referring to." "Mr. Stoll." Cho set her laptop on the table facing him. The screen showed the LLC filings, the financial routing records, the Harwick Advisory Board roster. "We have 14 months of financial records, 8 months of a law enforcement officer's internal documentation, and 3 independently corroborated testimonies that place you at the operational center of a scheme that used county resources to run a protection racket, harass and remove witnesses, and redirect public funds." She sat down across from him. "What we're currently missing is a copy of the transaction records that were removed from this facility tonight. I believe you have them, and I believe you haven't had time to move them outside this building because this building has been locked since 1:05. Stoll looked at the laptop. He looked at Cho. He looked at the briefcase beside his chair. "If I cooperate," he said. "That's a conversation for your attorney," Cho said. "Right now I'm asking about the records." A long pause, the kind that contained a great deal of calculation. He reached down, unlatched the briefcase, and set a USB drive on the table. "That's everything Pruitt pulled tonight," he said. "I haven't had time to do anything with it." Cho looked at the drive. She looked at Stoll. She picked up the drive with a gloved hand and gave it to the CID agent at the door. "Raymond Stoll," she said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, misappropriation of public funds, obstruction of a federal investigation, and criminal conspiracy." She stood. "Now you can call your attorney." It was 3:20 in the morning when Claire finally sat down in a chair that wasn't temporary. The trauma floor was quiet. The soldiers who were still admitted were stable. Sergeant Decker had been moved to a room on the 2nd floor and was, per the night nurse's last check, sleeping. The parking lot below had lost 2 of the black SUVs and gained 2 standard federal vehicles. The 4th one, the one Stoll had driven in, had been processed by the CID team and was now behind a barrier tape that looked strange in a hospital parking lot, but was doing exactly what barrier tape was meant to do. Reyes found her at 3:30. "Stoll's attorney is en route from Phoenix," she said. "Pruitt is in custody. Krebs is giving a full recorded statement." She sat down in the chair beside Claire, which meant she was exhausted, because Reyes had not sat down casually once since Claire had met her. "The transaction records on the drive are intact and match the originals from Fitch's files." Claire nodded. "The case is complete," Reyes said. "All 3 components, the assault and misconduct, the hospital scheme, the county financial fraud. We have enough for federal prosecution on all counts. She looked at the window. Holloway is in a federal holding facility in Phoenix. Stoll is here until his attorney arrives. Pruitt is in county lockup under federal hold, different county than Harwick. The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing charges, Claire said. In the morning, formally. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You know what's going to happen when this goes public. Yes. Your name is in every document. I know. And you're okay with that. Claire considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the parking structure, 11 minutes, watching the clock. She thought about the legal pad she'd started filling out before anyone arrived. She thought about Patricia Okafor, wherever she was tonight, not knowing yet that the thing that had ended her career at this hospital was about to be dismantled in federal court. I'm not okay with everything that happened, she said. I don't think I'm supposed to be. She looked at the window. But I'm okay with my name being in the documents. It's already in the documents. It's been in a lot of documents. She paused. At least these ones say the right things. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. The single nod version that Claire was starting to understand meant the most when it came from this particular person. Whitfield wants to meet at 8, Reyes said. I'd recommend getting a few hours before that. I will. Claire stood. She picked up her legal pad. The whole thing, 37 pages of it now, the most documented night of her civilian life. She looked at Reyes. The anonymous tip about Stoll's LLC filings, she said, in Krebs's documentation. He had those for 8 months, and he chose tonight to surface them. Yes, Reyes said. What made him choose tonight? Reyes was quiet for a moment. He said it was because of what he watched on the trauma floor, during the mass casualty response. She paused. He said, and I'm quoting him exactly here, that he had been telling himself for 8 months that the right time would come and that the situation would resolve itself, and that watching you walk back into a building you'd been thrown out of to keep 17 soldiers alive made him understand that the right time doesn't come. You make it. Claire looked at the window for a long moment. Then she picked up her jacket, tucked the legal pad under her arm, and walked toward the exit. She was almost at the door when Reyes said from behind her, "One more thing." Claire turned. Holloway asked, when they were processing him tonight, who had filed the original federal complaint that flagged his name. Reyes looked at her steadily. He thought it was someone inside his department, someone with access to the case files. He kept asking. He couldn't understand how it had happened. What did they tell him? Claire said. That a routine flag on a federal incident report, filed when a military personnel database cross-referenced a county assault report, had been picked up by CID as part of a standing order to flag incidents involving individuals with certain service classifications. Which is accurate, Claire said. Which is completely accurate, Reyes said, and which will never make sense to him, because he'll spend the rest of his life trying to understand how a nurse he shoved against a wall became the thing that ended him. She paused, and the answer is that she didn't. He ended himself. The moment he decided she was small enough to push around, he made every decision that followed inevitable. Claire stood at the door with her jacket and her legal pad and 37 pages of a night that had started in a maintenance kitchen and ended with 4 people in federal custody. "Good night, Agent Reyes," she said. "Good night, Voss." She went through the door. In the parking lot, under the sodium lights, she stopped for a moment and breathed the night air, dry, warm, carrying the faint edge of the desert that lay beyond Harwick's limits. Somewhere in that city, a network that had run on fear and administrative cover for 2 years was in the process of being disassembled piece by piece. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, a man who had spent years believing his badge made him untouchable was sitting in a room where it didn't. She looked up at the building. 4th floor, the advisory board conference room, the lights still on. The parking lot's peripheral camera, mounted at the northeast corner, covered the stairwell exit and the main entrance, and would have captured everything that happened in the first hour of the lockdown. She knew this because she had spent 4 years learning every camera angle in this building, in the same quiet, methodical way she had learned everything she had ever needed to know. Without announcing it, without performing it, simply because it was the kind of knowledge that mattered. She walked to her car, her phone buzzed. A text from the prepaid number, Krebs, the last message of the night. for what it's worth. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. She looked at it for a moment, then she typed back. You said it when it counted. She put the car in drive. Behind her, the fourth floor light went out as the CID team finished processing the conference room, and Calloway General settled into the late-night quiet of a building that had been many things today and would be required to be several things more before it was finished with all of this. But in the morning, a U.S. attorney would file charges that named every person who had believed that silence was permanent and that the right kind of pressure applied to the right kind of person would make problems disappear. And every one of them had been wrong about which person they were dealing with. She drove home with the windows down. Not because it was particularly pleasant at 3:40 in the morning. The desert air had cooled to the point where it had an edge, and she hadn't slept in 22 hours. But because she needed the sensation of moving through open space after a day spent inside walls that had felt progressively smaller, and then suddenly, at the end, had felt like something else entirely. She drove the long route, the one that took her past the east side of Harwick, where the streets were quiet and the streetlights were spaced further apart, and she let herself have the 20 minutes without thinking about what came next. She was not someone who processed things quickly in the emotional register. She had learned this about herself over years in situations that demanded the opposite, that she stay functional and forward-moving while things were actively happening, and deal with what the things had cost her afterward, usually alone, usually at an hour when no one would notice. It was not a healthy pattern in the abstract. It had been a survival mechanism in the specific, and she had made peace with the distinction. She thought about Gerald Pruitt in Bay 4 2 mornings ago, asking about his dog. She thought about the orderly whose name she'd never learned, who had been standing in the hallway when Holloway had walked her backward into the wall, who had looked at the floor, who had made the calculation that most people made when the person with the badge was angry. She thought about Arav Pillai saying, I should have said something yesterday, and I didn't. She thought about Krebs in the corridor at 1 in the morning, 8 months of documentation on a personal drive, waiting for the moment that would make it usable. None of them were villains. Most of them were people who had made reasonable decisions in situations that had been constructed to make the wrong choice look like the only choice. That was how it worked. That was always how it worked. The mechanism wasn't crude force. Crude force left marks, and marks became evidence. The mechanism was an architecture of discouragement, built carefully enough that the people inside it couldn't quite see its edges. You pushed someone into a corner and then made the corner feel like their idea. The problem, in Holloway's case, was that he had pushed someone who had stood in considerably smaller spaces than a hospital break room and had not flinched in any of them. She pulled into her driveway at 4:07 and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front of her house, the small porch light she'd left on, the dead plant in the pot by the front door that she kept meaning to replace, the whole modest material evidence of a life she had built carefully and quietly after the other one had ended. She felt, sitting there, a complicated affection for it. Not the life she'd planned, not the life certain people thought she should have, the life she'd actually made out of the materials she'd had in the years since. She went inside. She set the legal pad on the kitchen table. She drank a glass of water standing at the sink the way she always did when she came home from a long shift, and then she went to bed and slept without dreaming, which was a mercy she didn't take for granted. The meeting with Whitfield was at 8. She was there at 7:55, which was not early. It was on time by the standards of the environment she'd been trained in, where on time meant assembled and ready before the scheduled moment rather than arriving at it. The meeting was not at Calloway General. It was at a federal field office on the north side of Harwick, a building that looked from the outside like a regional insurance company and from the inside like exactly what it was. Whitfield was already in the conference room when she arrived. So was Reyes, and a man she hadn't met, civilian, 50s, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in institutional settings and had learned to carry authority without displaying it. His name was Deputy Undersecretary Warren Aldridge, and he worked for a branch of the Department of Defense that Whitfield introduced with a designation rather than a full name, which told Claire what kind of branch it was. Captain Voss, Aldridge said. Ms. Voss, she said. I'm not active. Not currently, he said, and left the rest of that sentence where he left it. They sat. Coffee was on the table and nobody touched it for the first several minutes, which Claire noted as an indicator of the room's disposition. People who are comfortable take coffee. People who are assessing don't. Whitfield spoke first. What happened at Calloway General yesterday is going to generate attention. The federal arrests, the military connection through the convoy, your service record entering the public record through the court filings, all of it is going to be visible in a way that can't be managed into invisibility. I understand that, Claire said. What we'd like, Aldridge said, is to discuss what comes next for you, before the visibility creates its own momentum. She looked at him. What are you offering? Nothing with a deadline, he said, which she respected, and nothing you have to decide in this room. He set a folder on the table, pushed it toward her, but didn't open it. There's a program, Joint DoD and Civilian Medical, that operates in transitional and conflict-adjacent environments. Medical capacity building, trauma system development, training for local medical personnel in areas where the infrastructure doesn't exist yet. He paused. The program has been looking for someone who can operate at the intersection of military medical protocol and civilian trauma systems. Someone who can walk into a room that doesn't have the resources it needs and build function out of what's available. Claire looked at the folder without touching it. The position would carry a civilian classification, Aldridge continued, with military advisory status. It's not a return to active service. It's something different. He paused again. It's also not a desk. She looked at Whitfield. Is this connected to yesterday, or was it already in motion? Both, Whitfield said. The position has existed for 8 months. Your name was raised 6 weeks ago through channels that had nothing to do with Harwick County. He said it directly, which she appreciated. Yesterday accelerated the conversation. It didn't create it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the folder and opened it. She read it with the same attention she gave to patient charts, systematically, without skipping, noting what was present and what was absent and what the gaps suggested. It took 8 minutes. Neither Whitfield nor Aldridge spoke while she read, which was correct. She closed the folder. I want to see the full operational parameters, she said, not the summary document, the actual scope and the actual constraints. We can arrange that, Aldridge said, and I want 30 days before I give an answer. That's reasonable. And I want my position at Calloway General restored on the record in full, regardless of what I decide about this. She looked at him steadily. Not as a precondition to my decision, as the correct outcome of what happened, independent of any decisions I make afterward. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. It's already done, he said. That happened at 11:58 last night. I know, she said. I'm stating it for the record because I want it understood that I'm not trading one for the other. She paused. What happened to me at that hospital happened to other people before me, and it would have happened to others after me. The investigation matters because of all of it, not because of me specifically. Reyes, who had been quiet through the meeting, said from across the table, Patricia Okafor and Marcus Swan's records are being formally corrected through the federal proceedings. The hospital has been notified that both of their employment records at Calloway General will reflect no adverse findings. She looked at Claire. They've both been contacted. How did they respond? Claire said. Okafor cried, Reyes said without embellishment. Swan asked if there was anything he needed to sign. Claire nodded. She looked at the window, the Harwick Street outside. An ordinary morning in a city that was about to find out it had been run, in part, by people who had decided that power was a private resource rather than a public trust. Is there anything else for today? She said. One thing, Whitfield said. He set a separate document on the table. Not a folder, a single page, official letterhead, with a citation number at the top. Your actions during the mass casualty response are being formally recognized through the Army's civilian commendation process. Sergeant Decker's surgical team submitted a report this morning. The decompression you performed, the triage sequencing, the stabilization of the femoral bleed, 3 of the 17 outcomes yesterday were directly attributable to your decisions in the first 20 minutes. She looked at the page. The language was formal and specific in the way military commendation language was. It named actions and outcomes, not feelings. She appreciated that. I was doing my job, she said. Yes, Whitfield said. You were. That's why it's being recognized. She folded the document carefully and put it inside the cover of her legal pad. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges at 10:15 that morning. Claire heard about it on the radio while she was driving back toward Calloway General, not because she was scheduled to work, but because there were things she needed to say to people who were still there, and she had learned over a long time that the things you needed to say got harder the longer you waited to say them. The radio coverage was, at first, cautious, in the way local news was cautious when county officials were involved, hedged, heavy on the word alleged, careful with the institutional affiliations. By the time she parked in the hospital lot, the coverage had shifted. A second outlet had the financial component. A third had the connection to the property management company. Someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office, not Cho, someone below her, had given background that included the mechanism, how the false controlled substance reports had been generated, how the badge cloning worked, how the pattern had operated across multiple victims over 26 months. Patricia Okafor's name was in the third report. Marcus Swan's was in the fourth. Neither of their names was attached to anything shameful. They were described as targets of a coordinated intimidation scheme, which was accurate, which was what they had always been, and which had simply required a federal filing to say it in a form that couldn't be revised by anyone with a county administrator's access, and a motivation to make history look different than it was. She sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes and listened to the radio. Then she went inside. Tomas, the night nurse who had worked the full overnight shift, was still on the floor when she arrived, 2 hours past the end of his shift, because the day staff was short, and he was the kind of person who stayed. He looked at her when she came through the ambulance bay entrance, and his face did something complicated. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of someone whose understanding of a situation has just been updated and is still processing the update. "It's all over the radio," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you—" He stopped. Started again. "Are you coming back?" She looked at him. "I'm working on the paperwork," she said, which was true. "Go home, Tomas. You've been here for 14 hours. 15, he said, with the particular resignation of someone who had stopped counting for comfort and started counting out of habit. "Go home," she said again, and put enough in it that he nodded and started moving toward the locker room. Pillai found her at the central station, where she was looking at the board, not because she was assigned to anything, but because the board was the fastest way to understand what a floor needed, and the floor always needed something. "The formal reinstatement paperwork comes through HR," he said, without preamble. "Probably today, given the circumstances. Bennett has already signed off." "I know," she said. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the board too. "Decker is asking about you," he said. "Sergeant Decker. He's been awake since 6. She hadn't planned to go upstairs. She had planned to deal with the necessary conversations on this floor, and then go home and sleep for another several hours before deciding what the rest of the week looked like. But Pillai had said it the way he said things that were actually requests disguised as information, and she had known him long enough to know the difference. She went upstairs. Sergeant First Class Marcus Decker was 26 years old, from a small city in eastern Tennessee, and he was sitting up in his hospital bed with the alert posture of someone whose body had been seriously damaged, but whose mind had fully returned to operational status. His chest was wrapped. His color was better than it had been on the trauma floor, where the oxygen saturation dropping had given his face a particular gray cast that she had filed away as a data point and was glad to see replaced. He looked at her when she came in. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Claire Voss. The doctor told me what you did." He said it with the directness of someone who hadn't been raised to build toward things. "The needle. The decompression? Yes." He said if you'd waited another few minutes— "I didn't wait," she said, "so it doesn't matter." He looked at her for a moment. He had the particular quality of a young person who had been through something that had rearranged his understanding of what the world cost and what it gave back, and who was still in the early stage of sitting with that rearrangement. "Are you okay?" he said. "I heard on the news this morning about what happened to you here." She looked at him. The question surprised her slightly. Not its presence, but its direction. He was 26 and had been through a vehicle rollover and a tension pneumothorax and was asking if she was okay. "Getting there," she said, which was more honest than fine. He nodded. "My unit," he said. "The guys who didn't make it to surgery in time. How many?" 17 patients, she said. "All 17 are alive." She said it directly because he deserved the direct version. 2 are in Tucson at the military facility. 3 are still here. The rest were treated and transferred. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something in his face that was relief doing the heavy lifting of not collapsing into something more complicated in front of a stranger. "Thank you," he said. "Do your physical therapy," she said. "That's how you thank me." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, which was the right response, and she went back downstairs. The moment with Bennett was the one she had been least certain about. He was in his office, which was unusual for mid-morning on a weekday. Bennett was typically on the floor in the late morning, doing the circuit of administrative presence that was most of what his job required of him. That he was in his office, door slightly open, suggested he was waiting for something, possibly her. She knocked on the doorframe. He looked up. He looked worse than he had the night before, in the way that some people looked worse in daylight, the bags under his eyes more visible, the particular tension of a bad night showing in the set of his jaw. He had been running the floor during a federal investigation of the floor. He ran, which was not a comfortable position, regardless of one's specific role in what had gone wrong. "Your reinstatement is processing," he said. "HR has the federal documentation. It should be in the system by this afternoon." "Thank you," she said. A pause. He looked like he wanted to say something else. She waited. "I called Patricia Okafor this morning," he said. She hadn't expected that. "What did she say?" "She said—" He stopped. She said she'd think about it, whether she wanted to come back. He looked at his desk. "I don't think she will." "Probably not," Claire said. "That doesn't mean the call wasn't worth making." He nodded. Another pause. "I'm not going to pretend I handled this well," he said, "and I'm not going to tell you I've made sense of it yet, but I want you to know—" He stopped again. Started differently. "The floor works better when you're on it. Everyone knows that. I knew that. You chose the path of least resistance," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "I know. I don't think you're a bad person, Bennett. I think you're a person who made bad choices when the stakes were high enough to matter." She looked at him steadily. "The difference between a bad person and a good person who made bad choices is what you do next. You have time to figure out which one you are." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected either absolution or condemnation and had received neither, which was perhaps more useful than either would have been. She left his office and went back to the floor. The afternoon brought two things she hadn't anticipated. The first was a call from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Marcus Swan, who was, as Reyes had said, a man who wanted to know what he needed to sign. He was 31, living in Flagstaff, working at an urgent care clinic under a cloud that was now officially lifted. He asked about the paperwork, he asked about the timeline, he asked one question at the end that had nothing to do with paperwork. Holloway, did he know he was being investigated before last night? "No," Claire said. "So he just kept going," Swan said. "Just kept doing it." "Yes," she said. A silence. "Okay," he said. And then, more quietly, "Okay," as if a door that had been stuck had just moved. The second thing was Hargrove. He called at 2:15 from the military medical facility in Tucson, where he was being treated for the arm fracture and the head laceration and what the facility doctors had described to him as a moderate concussion that he had been treating as an inconvenience. His voice was clearer than it had been in the hospital bay. The concussion fog was lifting. "I've been in contact with Whitfield," he said. "I know," she said. "He says you asked for 30 days. "I did." "Good," he said. 30 days is the right call." A pause. "For what it's worth, and I understand it might not be worth much given how I handled the end of your service, I think you should do it, the program." He said it without pressure, just stated it. "Not because you owe anybody anything, because it's the right scale for what you're capable of." She looked out the window of the staff kitchen, the maintenance one, which had become, over the past 36 hours, a place that felt like hers in a way no room in this building had quite felt before. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. And then because he was Hargrove and Hargrove did not linger on things. "How are you holding up?" "Getting there," she said again, which was the true answer, the one she'd started giving instead of the automatic one. "Good enough," he said. "Get some sleep." The preliminary hearing for Dale Holloway was 3 weeks later, in federal court in Phoenix. Claire drove down alone. She had been subpoenaed as a witness, and she intended to testify, but the preliminary hearing was not the testimony. It was the formal airing of the charges, the reading of the evidence summary. The first moment that the architecture of what had been built against her and the others became visible in a setting that was not a hospital corridor or a maintenance kitchen, but a room specifically designed for the purpose of making things public and permanent. She wore the same kind of clothes she always wore when she needed to be taken seriously. Dark blazer, clean lines, nothing that invited a secondary conversation about anything other than what she was saying. She sat in the gallery with Cho's associate beside her and watched the proceedings with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. Holloway was present. He looked different than he had at Calloway General. Smaller, or not smaller exactly, but reduced, the way things look when you take away the context that made them seem large. Without the uniform, without the building, without Krebs in the doorway, and Darla Fitch in the hallway, and Bennett willing to look at the floor, he was a middle-aged man in a suit sitting at a defense table being read a list of things he had done. The list was long: assault under color of law, official misconduct, evidence tampering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, civil rights violations under federal statute. The financial charges would be in a separate filing, the U.S. Attorney's Office had decided to keep the criminal conspiracy component as its own case, which Cho had explained to Claire as a strategic decision to ensure that each component of the scheme received the full weight of prosecution rather than being bundled into a plea arrangement that resolved everything with a single reduced charge. Stoll's preliminary hearing had been the week before. His attorney had arrived from Phoenix with a strategy that was visible from the moment he walked through the door. Diminish the client's role, emphasize the complexity of county administrative structures, suggest that the financial arrangements were a matter of interpretation. Cho had presented 18 months of financial documentation, 3 corroborating witnesses, and a digital trail that the defense strategy did not survive contact with. Pruitt had entered a cooperation agreement. His testimony, combined with Fitch's, provided the connective tissue that linked Holloway's field operations to Stoll's administrative cover, in a way that the defense attorneys for both of the other defendants were still trying to find a counterargument for. Krebs testified in a closed proceeding. Claire didn't know the specifics of what he said, but she knew that 8 months of documentation organized by a man who had been patient enough to build a case instead of just reporting a suspicion was not a small thing. She knew that his cooperation had required a kind of courage that was different from the kind she was more familiar with, not the immediate, reactive kind, the kind that happened in 40 seconds in a trauma bay, but the slow, sustained kind that required getting up every morning and continuing to document things that could have ended his career if discovered prematurely, for 8 months, without knowing if the right moment would ever arrive. She respected it. She thought it might actually be harder than the other kind. After the hearing, she stood on the courthouse steps in the Phoenix afternoon. Dry heat, the sun at an angle that turned everything golden and slightly brutal, and Cho came out and stood beside her. Holloway's attorney is going to argue diminished responsibility, Cho said. They're going to say he was operating under direction from Stoll and Pruitt and didn't understand the full scope. Will it work? Claire said. No, Cho said. The assault is on camera. The false report is documented. Whatever Stoll directed, Holloway executed with enthusiasm and personal investment. She paused. He's going to prison. The question is how long? And Stoll? Longer, Cho said. They stood on the steps for a moment in the heat. There's something I want to ask you, Cho said. Professionally, not officially. She looked at Claire. When you walked back into that building during the mass casualty response, knowing you were suspended, knowing Holloway had told security to arrest you if you came back, what was the calculation? Claire looked at the Phoenix Street, the palms, the grid of a city that operated in its own particular logic. There wasn't one, she said. Not in the way you mean. I heard the scanner traffic, and I knew what the floor was walking into. The calculation would have been whether to not go back. That one I didn't bother with. Cho was quiet for a moment. Most people, she said, would have made the calculation. Most people weren't me, Claire said without arrogance. Just as a statement of difference, the way you'd note a distinction in blood type or operating range. Cho looked at her. Then she said, the commendation from the Army, that's going to be made public when the federal proceedings are filed, along with your full service record, the unclassified portions. I know, Claire said. It's going to change how people understand what happened at Calloway General, Cho said. The narrative is going to be— I know what the narrative is going to be, Claire said. I'm not interested in the narrative. She looked at Cho directly. I'm interested in Patricia Okafor having her record corrected. I'm interested in Marcus Swan not having to explain a false suspension to every employer he ever talks to. I'm interested in the patients on that floor. Not just the soldiers, the civilian patients. Having a floor that isn't being used as an instrument by people who thought it was theirs to use. She paused. The narrative can take care of itself. Cho looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, You're a difficult person to work with in the traditional sense. Yes, Claire said. I mean that as a compliment. I know, Claire said, and this time there was something in it that wasn't quite a smile, but was its functional equivalent. She gave Whitfield her answer at 29 days, because 30 felt like a performance of deliberateness, and she had finished deliberating at 26 and saw no reason to hold the answer for the remainder of the countdown. She sat in the same federal field office on the north side of Harwick. The same table. Whitfield, Reyes, Aldridge in the same seats. The coffee was from the same machine, and this time all four of them took it, which was a different room than the one they'd started in. Yes, she said, with the conditions I specified and the full operational parameters reviewed. Aldridge nodded. The parameters are ready for your review today. Good. She looked at Whitfield. I also want it understood that I'll complete the current quarter at Calloway General before the transition. The floor has been through a significant disruption. Walking out in the middle of the stabilization period is not something I'm willing to do. We anticipated that, Whitfield said. The start date was built around a 4-month lead time. She nodded, picked up the coffee, drank it. The decision sat in her chest not as a resolution, but as the beginning of something, which was, she had learned, what all decisions actually felt like if you were paying attention. The last week of her tenure at Calloway General as a floor nurse, before the administrative transition to the new role was formalized, was unremarkable in the best way. Ordinary shifts, ordinary problems. A 67-year-old with a bowel obstruction who required 3 consultations and a significant amount of patience. A 12-year-old who had broken his arm falling out of a tree and was more interested in whether he'd be able to play baseball than in the fracture itself. An elderly woman with pneumonia who was scared and who needed someone to sit with her for 12 minutes between the diagnostic results and the treatment plan, not because there was nothing else to do, but because 12 minutes with a person who was scared was also clinical care. And Claire had learned this in places where the opposite lesson would have been easier. On her last shift, Thomas brought coffee to the central station without being asked and set it next to her without saying anything, which was his version of ceremony, and she accepted it as such. Pillai came by at end of shift. He stood beside her at the station, both of them looking at the board the way they had stood the night of the convoy. The board as the common language between them, the thing that said what was needed without requiring either of them to find other words. You're going to be wasted on whatever they've got you doing, he said. I was wasted here, she said. That was the point. He looked at her. No, he said. You weren't. Not entirely. He said it with the careful specificity of someone who had thought about it before saying it. The people you kept alive on this floor for 4 years, that wasn't wasted. It was just not the whole of what you were capable of. She looked at the board, at the names on it, the rooms, the status indicators, the immediate compressed world of a floor that would keep running after she left, would keep needing people who could read it at a glance and understand what it required. Take care of this floor, she said. I'm trying, he said. She handed him her last chart note, signed off the board, and walked out. 4 months later, Dale Holloway was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for assault under color of law, civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and evidence tampering. He was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs, and the expression on his face was not the one he'd worn in the break room of Calloway General, the assured, deliberate expression of a man who believed that the architecture around him would hold. It was something smaller and more ordinary, the expression of a person confronting the gap between who they had believed themselves to be and what the record showed. Raymond Stoll received 14 years, the financial fraud charges carrying a federal mandatory minimum that his attorney had not managed to negotiate around despite considerable effort. He was, according to the Harwick County Gazette, the most senior county official ever convicted of federal charges in the county's history. which was a distinction that would have meant something different to him if circumstances had been different. Ellis Pruitt, under the cooperation agreement, received a reduced sentence, 3 years plus restitution. His testimony had been, per the federal prosecutor's office, substantial and corroborated. He would serve his time and come out the other side as the person who had helped build the case that brought down his own network, which was a complicated identity to carry and was, in the opinion of several people who had thought about it, a reasonable consequence for a complicated set of choices. Darla Fitch received a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation, reduced further by her early cooperation and by the fact that her role had been administrative rather than operational. She did not return to healthcare administration. She moved to a city in Northern California, and as far as anyone who tracked these things knew, she spent some time thinking about the particular cost of looking the other way. The unnamed deputy whose credentials had been used to pull Holloway's vehicle from impound was identified through the parking structure footage and charged with accessory to obstruction. He was 24 years old and had worked for the county for 8 months. His sentencing would take additional time, pending cooperation discussions. Patricia Okafor did not come back to nursing at Calloway General. She came back to nursing somewhere else, a community clinic in Tempe, which was not the career trajectory she had been on before Holloway's mechanism had derailed her, but which was, as she told a journalist who interviewed her 6 months after the sentencing, the place where she had decided to put herself. Her record was clean. The false suspension was formally expunged. She was, by every official measure, what she had always actually been, an experienced, competent nurse with an unblemished professional history. Marcus Swan returned to Harwick. He took a position at a different hospital, not Calloway General, which was his choice, and which everyone who understood what choices meant respected. He worked days. He was, according to people who worked with him, very good at his job. He had always been very good at his job. The record now reflected that. Claire landed in a country she had been to before, under circumstances she was not permitted to describe in any formal document, in a capacity that had no official title in the program's public materials. What she was doing was not glamorous and was not, most days, what anyone would describe as comfortable. It was useful, which had always been the thing she cared about most, and the thing she had always been most reluctant to articulate, because articulating it made it sound like a quality rather than a necessity. She was building a trauma response system in a region that didn't have one. She was training local medical personnel in assessment techniques that didn't require equipment they didn't have. She was learning, in the specific and ongoing way that fieldwork demanded, what it looked like to take the principles she had applied in an Army forward position and a hospital trauma bay and translate them into a context where neither of those institutions existed. She was not good at every part of it. She was too direct in some settings where directness was not the culturally appropriate register. She underestimated, occasionally, the emotional weight of situations that she had learned to process through procedure and that the people around her processed differently. She was working on it, which was a different thing from fixing it. What she was very good at was the thing she had always been very good at, walking into a room that was not working and making it work. Reading the resources available, understanding the gap between what existed and what was needed, and operating in that gap without requiring the gap to close before she could begin. She had learned this in the Army. She had maintained it in a hospital in Harwick, Arizona, where a man had believed that the easiest way to make someone small was to use the power of the institution standing behind him. She had learned, in the gap between those two places, that the power of an institution behind you was a real thing, and that it was also a thing that could be built, document by document, action by action, in the space that people who underestimated you had left behind. She thought about this sometimes, in the evenings, in a region that didn't look anything like Arizona and that smelled entirely different from the linoleum and industrial cleaner air of the Calloway General night shift. She thought about the legal pad, the 37 pages of a night that had started with someone else's decision about who she was and ended with her own. She thought about the thing Reyes had said in the parking lot of the courthouse, in the Phoenix heat, which she had not repeated to anyone but which she had carried. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand how a nurse he shoved against a wall became the thing that ended him. The answer was not complicated, though it had taken a certain kind of person in a certain kind of position to fail to understand it. She had not become anything. She had already been it. The shove had simply removed the last reason she had for keeping it quiet. That was the thing about people who used power the way Holloway had used it. The way anyone used it who had confused access to an institution with actual authority. They looked at the person in front of them, and they saw what that person appeared to be in that context, in that building, in those circumstances. They saw a nurse. They saw a target. They saw someone who could be managed. They did not ask what had made the person that quiet. They did not consider that the stillness had a source, or that the source might have been built in environments that made the present situation look uncomplicated by comparison. They saw the surface and they pressed on it, and they were consistently surprised when the surface turned out to be a door. The mistake was not cruelty exactly. Cruelty, at least, involves registering the person in front of you as a person. The mistake was something smaller and in some ways worse, the failure to be curious. The certainty that the size of a thing was determined by how it presented in the moment, rather than by what it had survived before the moment began. Claire Voss had survived quite a lot before that morning in the break room. She had just not bothered to mention it. She picked up her pen, opened her field notebook to a fresh page, and began writing the assessment for the following morning's training session. The resources available, the gaps she needed to close, the distance between where the people in front of her were and where they needed to be, and the most direct route from one to the other. She was good at distances. She had always been good at distances. She wrote until the light changed, and then she kept writing.